Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to do something truly fascinating. We are decoding authentic, handwritten historical study notes that break down the exact step-by-step mechanics of British imperial expansion in India. We aren't just looking at a random list of dates and names here. We're analyzing the actual blueprint of an empire drawn directly from our source material.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by looking at a specific century of expansion and then outline the 5 policies of control. From there, we'll examine the doctrine of Lapse, evaluate the strategic value of Sind, and finally, wrap up with the Russian threat and annexation.
All right, Section 1, a century of expansion, spanning the incredibly pivotal years from 1757 to 1857.
If you look closely at these original study notes, you'll see the very first policy adopted to establish the British Empire was the policy of economic control. It's absolutely crucial to understand that the foundation for this was laid even earlier with the Firman of 1717, which ultimately sparked the Battle of Plassey in 1757. And that battle? Well, that's the starting line for our century of focus, leading directly to the capture of Bengal. The empire essentially began by securing the purse strings and gaining absolute economic dominance.
Moving on to Section 2, the 5 policies of control, or what we can essentially call the imperial toolkit.
What's really interesting here is that the British didn't just rely on one single method. They utilized a constantly evolving toolkit. Starting with that economic control we just talked about, they progressed through subsidiary alliances and direct subordination, eventually moving into the doctrine of Lapse and finally leveraging maladministration. Depending on the state and the political climate of the time, they could pull the exact right tool for any geopolitical job.
Let's zoom in on the second policy, the subsidiary alliance. The notes define this explicitly as indirect subordination. Think of it almost like a hostile takeover, but from the inside. It gave the British a way to pull the strings from behind the curtain. They could keep local rulers on the throne while effectively dictating all of their foreign and military affairs without firing a single shot.
But, when indirect diplomacy wasn't enough, they shifted to a much heavier hand, direct subordination. The source notes accurately refer to this as the policy of war and conquest. This aggressive, direct military option was used to physically capture major, powerful states like Maratha, Punjab, and, as we'll explore in just a minute, Sind.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Doctrine of Lapse, a policy aggressively implemented by Lord Dalhousie from 1848 to 1856. This rule was a real game changer because it fundamentally upended local traditions. Basically, if a ruler died without a biological, rightful heir, their state was automatically annexed. And the absolute kicker here? Adoption was no longer a legal guarantee of succession. So an incredibly deeply ingrained local tradition was legally invalidated overnight, leaving these states completely defenseless against British annexation.
And this wasn't just some isolated legal trick. It was a sweeping, overarching strategy. Let's look directly at our source material to grasp the sheer scale of the territories that were just completely absorbed into the empire via this doctrine, often without a single battlefield casualty.
Our notes literally list the dominoes falling to Dalhousie's doctrine. Satara was the very first state annexed. That was quickly followed by Nagpur, Sambalpur, Zaidpur, Udaipur, Jhansi, and Tanjore. But the notes also make a point to mention an earlier, related event. The East India Company had actually annexed Kittur way back in 1824, following the revolt of Rani Chennamma over a very similar issue of succession. So the precedent had been set decades prior, but the doctrine of Lapse just formalized that land grab into undeniable official policy.
Finally, the notes identify a 5th, incredibly convenient policy: maladministration or misgovernance. Basically, if a ruler was deemed by the British to be governing poorly, the British claimed the moral and legal right to just step in and take over the whole shebang. This specific justification was successfully used to annex the state of Awadh. Okay, so now that we understand the tools in the kit, let's watch them get deployed in a high-stakes, real-world environment.
Section 4, the strategic value of Sind, looking at the geopolitical reality on the ground.
So you might be wondering, why was Sind so incredibly important to the British Empire during this specific era? I mean, it wasn't just an arbitrary target on a map. Massive geographical and economic realities made this particular region an absolute, undeniable priority. If we look at the handwritten notes on Anglo-Sindh relations, they make the answers perfectly clear. They reveal the exact, documented economic and strategic motivations that put a giant target on Sindh's back.
Let's break down those economic incentives exactly as they're written in the source. First off, Sindh possessed a highly connected network of roads and rivers, making it an absolute logistics dream. But it wasn't just locally important either. Sindh actively participated in maritime trade across the entire world. This prime economic and strategic positioning meant that whoever controlled Sindh literally controlled a massive, lucrative node in global commerce.
Which perfectly sets up Section 5, the Russian threat, and the urgency of the annexation.
We have to weigh two immense competing forces against each other here. On one side, you've got steady British expansion. On the other side, and this is what was really driving the urgency, was a severe and growing conflict with Russia in world politics. The notes highlight a very specific paranoia, the very real fear that Russia might invade India via Iran and Afghanistan. The stakes here were global supremacy, making Sindh a mandatory buffer zone for the British.
And this timeline right here, it brilliantly illustrates a perfect step-by-step escalation straight out of the playbook we just studied. Look at how it unfolds. In 1832, they start softly with Policy 1, Economic Control, signing a treaty to open vital roads and rivers. By 1839, driven by that mounting Russian threat, they escalate to Policy 2, a subsidiary alliance. Finally, in 1843, they jump straight to Policy 3, direct subordination, resulting in the complete, full annexation of Sindh into the British Empire.
The notes even give us the names of the key British figures who executed this final takeover. The British resident, Charles Napier, deeply embedded himself in the region, participating directly in the administrative system of Sindh to gain leverage. And this inside influence culminated in that aggressive 1843 annexation, which was fully authorized during the tenure of Governor-General Lord Ellenborough.
We've just examined the direct, handwritten evidence of exactly how an empire engineered its dominance, step by step. So I want to leave you with this thought. Looking at this incredibly calculated century of expansion, how might global history have shifted if that Russian threat had never actually materialized to accelerate things? Or what if rigid traps like the Doctrine of Lapse were simply never enforced? The mechanics of empire are incredibly complex, for sure, but decoding these blueprints shows us exactly how the modern map was drawn. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history.